To provide you with historical context as to why the polymath is so very important to society, we'll begin the festival with an exclusive lecture by Professor Peter Burke, one of the world's leading intellectual historians. Imagine a man spending decades immersed in investigating the history of knowledge. I came across his book when writing my own book, The Polymath, and found his multi-volume cultural history of knowledge to be a rich resource on how human knowledge evolved over time and in different contexts. So as a historian of knowledge, it's not surprising that he takes a special interest in polymaths, those whose knowledge is so wide-ranging and those who themselves contribute to different fields of knowledge. So come, let's start the festival by understanding what brought us here in the first place.
Today, I'd like to present a sketch for a social history of the polymath, or if you prefer, a historical sociology, looking at Europe over the last 500 years. A social approach means examining both the obstacles in the way of individuals who aspired to a great breadth of knowledge, but also the opportunities available to them at different times in the past. So one major obstacle right at the start is gender, not only for polymaths, but for scholars in general. It could be overcome by a high position in society. 17th century polymaths included Queen Christina of Sweden, and in England, the Duchess of Newcastle. In France in the 18th century, they included the Marquise de Châtelet. Not so easy if you were further down in the social scale. Alternatively, if you had a father who was a scholar, then you had a chance. Maria Agnesi in 18th century Bologna was the daughter of a professor in the same university. Dorothea von Schloetzer in Germany was the daughter of a famous historian who indeed deliberately gave her a tough education to turn her into a polymath at any cost. But if we speak more generally, it's only in the late 19th century that opportunities for women increased because they were at last admitted to some European universities. And I think it's only in the second half of the 20th century that one could say that women had reasonable opportunities, though not equal opportunities, to acquire wide knowledge compared to men. So after the problem of gender comes the problem of class. Clearly, if you had a humble origin, that was a major obstacle in your way. But that too could be surmounted. In the 18th century, I immediately think of Denis Diderot. His father was a craftsman. Actually, he made knives and forks. Or I think of Lomonosov in Russia, who was the son of a fisherman. But as an example of obstacles, Lomonosov wanted to participate in higher education. He walked all the way from the north of Russia to Moscow, which is really quite a distance, so that he could attend an academic institution in the capital city. Now, opportunities for children whose families were neither noble nor rich, they did expand in the 19th century. And you get one interesting phenomenon, which I call the working class polymath, or maybe it's more exact to say the working class equivalent of the polymath. For example, autodidacts who went to lectures on popular science, sometimes in mechanics institutes. They could read books and magazines in public libraries. They were driven by the desire for self-improvement. They ended up knowing a little about a lot of subjects, but actually not very much about any one. But some polymaths, in the strong sense of the term, came from humble origins in the 19th century. Think of T.H. Huxley. Charles Darwin was a gentleman, but T.H. Huxley was the son of an impecunious teacher of mathematics. H.G. Wells was the son of a shopkeeper and a domestic servant, but he still managed to teach himself. So much for beginnings. The question on what I'd like to focus now is that of obstacles and opportunities in the case of people who've already become scholars, or what we call scientists now. Because if their goal is to go beyond their special discipline, to branch out into others. Now, the opportunities vary according to the period. In the 16th century, one might say that polymathy is the default setting because, right, you go to university, you're expected to study 7 subjects, the 7 liberal arts. You begin with grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and you go on to music, arithmetic, and geometry, and astronomy. That's for everybody. You couldn't be a Bachelor of Arts without going through all that. In the 17th century, something rather similar. By this time, more subjects have been added to the curriculum. But still, in the 16th century, it was possible for the Italian Pico della Mirandola and the Englishman John Dee to claim that they dominated the whole of knowledge. Everything knowable was Pico's phrase. Now, if that means academic knowledge, I think the claim was more or less justified. But of course, there are many knowledges outside the academic curriculum. At this time, midwives, cooks, knights, merchants, and many kinds of artisans, they all had their own kinds of knowledge. I don't believe anybody has ever known everything that was to be known in their particular culture, at least not since the age of hunters and gatherers, and conceivably not even then. But speaking of know-how, one important feature of the Renaissance was the existence of a dialogue between the artisans on one side and the humanists and natural philosophers on the other. One side interested in knowing how, and the other in knowing what was the case. And it's been argued very plausibly that the rise of experiment in the 17th century is the result of this dialogue, adapting the trial and error of craftsmen to the verification of general principles about the natural world. The Renaissance might be said to have been a very good time to be a polymath. The printing press was making knowledge more available and more accessible than ever before. On the other hand, scholars were not required to make an original contribution to knowledge. They could spend their energy learning what was already known. Indeed, new discoveries were often frowned on. Novelty was generally equated with error, even though the discovery of the New World was producing a major challenge to that assumption ever since Columbus or even earlier. But in my personal view, it was the 17th century that was the golden age of polymaths. Novelty was becoming respectable. The invasion of other continents by soldiers, merchants, and missionaries brought much new knowledge back to Europe, along with other kinds of loot. And the invention of the telescope and the microscope offered opportunities for the exploration of other worlds. So I'm viewing the 17th century as a moment of equilibrium. Scholars had opportunities to know more than their predecessors, but they weren't drowned in information like their successors. It was just about possible for Leibniz, for example, whose interests He's remembered as a philosopher, but his interests actually included law, history, mining, languages, and much more. It was possible for him to create his own synthesis, although even Leibniz, at least once, confessed to being overwhelmed by information. And he certainly wasn't the last to say this, but he may have been one of the first. He said, there are just too many books, not humanly possible to read them all. Now, that long moment of equilibrium could not last. Information was still pouring into Europe or being created in Europe, and a single individual could no longer master the whole thing. Even Diderot, whose wide knowledge made him the ideal editor of the most famous encyclopedia of the 18th century, recognized, I quote him in translation, universal knowledge is no longer within the reach of man. And Diderot noticed very early on this trend towards specialization, beginning in medicine, where it's relatively easy. You can specialize in a part of the body, you can specialize in a particular disease or whatever. But then in the 19th century, specialization went still further. The word scientist was coined to separate people who knew a lot about the natural world from the scholars who knew about the humanities. And then the word specialization was coined in English, French, German, and later in other languages. And there was a whole debate about this. Some people thought the division of intellectual labor was a very good thing, and it would lead to more productivity in the world of knowledge, like the division of labor inside the factory. On the other hand, other scholars were saying knowledge has become fragmented, and so we're worse off than we were in a previous century. I should say at this point, I'm not arguing against specialization. I'm arguing against over-specialization, or I'm simply worried about the cost of specialization. Without it, many discoveries would never have been made. But the major cost is intellectual myopia. That is a failure to see the big picture, a failure to see how the little bit of the world of knowledge that you dominate, how it's connected to everything else. So in the 19th century, if you look at universities, which were increasing in number, the range of disciplines taught and studied became much wider than it had ever been before. The trouble is that the options available to any single student became much narrower than ever before. So if you joined the Faculty of History at Cambridge, you were expected just to study history and so on. Even so, in the 19th century, the division between the two cultures of the arts and the sciences, denounced by C.P. Snow in the 1950s, it was much less visible than in the 20th century. I think of it as a crack. It only became a big gap in the 20th century. Individuals such as George Eliot, who was a polymath as well as a novelist, and her partner George Henry Lewis, who was another polymath. Now, they were equally at home in both cultures. Now, so far, I've been talking about opportunities to become a polymath. But from the point of view of a sociologist, one has to ask about their niche in the ecology of knowledge. Or more down to earth, you can say, how could polymaths make a living? Now, one result of the increase of specialization in the last 2 centuries or so has been to destroy niche that polymaths already inhabited. One of them was the library. In the 17th century, a number of polymaths became librarians and a number of librarians were polymaths. Of course, they have marvelous qualifications for the job since they try to read all the books, or at least books of every kind. But from the late 19th century, they're disqualified because they haven't studied librarianship, a new study, whether at the university or in some other kind of college. Librarian became an independent profession. You turn to journalism, it's a similar story of opportunities for amateurs disappearing with the rise of the profession. So for much of the 19th century, take the example of Britain, polymaths such as Macaulay and once again George Eliot could live on the money they received from writing essays and reviews in the great journals, the intellectual journals of the time, Edinburgh Review, Westminster Review. Same in France with the Revue des Deux Mondes. But today, scholars can still write for the Times Literary Supplement or the London Review of Books, but what they get is just pocket money. Impossible to live on that. You need to have an academic job, which means teaching, which means administration. Even in universities, niche for polymaths are disappearing. As I think a revealing anecdote will make this clear. In the 1930s, the Hungarian refugee polymath, Michael Polanyi, he became professor of chemistry at the University of Manchester. And one day he went to see the Vice Chancellor and he said, Vice Chancellor, basically he said, I don't want to teach chemistry anymore. Actually, I'm really a philosopher. So what does the Vice Chancellor do? He changes Polanyi's title, moves him along the campus. That's all. But imagine going to see the Vice Chancellor of a university today and say that you want to change your discipline to one extremely remote from it. I don't think universities work like that anymore. There are just a few very small niche in universities or in institutes of advanced study, which do exist in a number of parts of the world, but not in very great numbers. Now, to my surprise, when I was beginning to write the book, I thought that polymaths, it was really going to be very difficult to be a polymath, even in the late 19th century. And yet until today, they have shown a remarkable resistance to the rise of specialization. But today, I think they really are an endangered species. A few remarkable polymaths are still active. Polymaths in the strongest sense of making original contributions to several disciplines, not only knowing a bit about them. Unfortunately, they're all members of older generations, such as mine. And I have to confess now, I cannot think of any serious creative polymath who was born after the year 1960. I hope I'm wrong, but I've said this in lectures and haven't been convinced so far with any of the names that people have come up with. And so I end with a question. Is this remarkable intellectual species finally going to become extinct? Thank you for your attention. So I think there's a wide and a narrow definition of a polymath. When I began writing the book about the polymath, so I had to make a big decision. Will I investigate polymaths in a precise and narrow sense? That is, as the ancient Greeks already defined the term, people who have mastered many intellectual disciplines. But the wide definition is many-sided people, whatever the activity is. So that if you are a successful singer who happens to be an athlete and maybe becomes a member of parliament, then you're a polymath without necessarily dominating any intellectual discipline. So, and definitely then there are many-sided doers. My generation didn't call them polymaths. I have been noticing that quite a lot of younger people do use the term in that wider sense. That okay, as long as one knows which group one's talking about. Second question is about female polymaths and whether they've been neglected. Well, I think polymaths were neglected, whatever their gender. And until maybe 30 years ago, historians, for example, didn't have a great place for women in their history. And this has changed very dramatically. At the same time as, not coincidence, that you find many more women in university teaching. Indeed, more female students than when I went to university in the 1950s. So there is a change, which means that in the future, and probably not a distant future, there will be a searchlight will be focused on more female polymaths. But I have to say that, well, quite a number of them have been well known for quite a long time, including the ones I mentioned a few minutes ago. So now you have a question about non-Western polymaths. And of course, this was a question I had to face when I started writing this book, because I don't know any non-European language. Of course, I don't know lots of European languages either, but I don't know any Chinese, and China is famous for polymaths, nor do I know Arabic or Persian, whereas in what Westerners call the Middle Ages, there definitely was a flourishing of polymaths in that part of the world. But I'm happy to say that there is a secondary literature in different European languages, especially English, French, and German, but not only, Italian, Spanish as well. And I did my best to write based on this. But of course, I was much more worried about whether I'd been successful in that part of the book. And so I did consult friends. So luckily, I have a neighbor, somebody who lives in the next street to me in Cambridge, Geoffrey Lloyd, who is one of the great authorities on ancient Chinese science. So he read my section. And again, luckily, I had made friends with Tarif Khalidi, who used to be a professor of Arabic at Cambridge, which is how I got to know him. He's gone back to Beirut now. So he kindly read the whole section I wrote about the world of Islam. And so he said it seems okay to him, and then I felt safe. But so the real answer to your question is, although Chinese polymaths and Islamic polymaths are not well known in Europe, there have been specialists who've written about them, so there is accessible knowledge in Western languages. Now comes what's a bit like the $100,000 question about the three top polymaths, or if not the three top polymaths, at least my favorite three, which is a lot easier to answer. And as you probably have guessed Leonardo has to be there, although I was a little bit tempted by Aristotle, but no, I'll go for Leonardo as number one. Leibniz for number two. Somebody that's really remarkable in the way that he combined depth with breadth. I mean, people often criticize polymaths. They must be superficial. You can't know about so many things and not be superficial. Well, Leibniz shows that that doesn't have to be true. And finally, maybe it reveals something that the last choice only takes us to the early 19th century, but I think it has to be Alexander von Humboldt. Quite extraordinary, because he made so many original discoveries in more disciplines than I could list in 5 minutes if I could remember them all. So that's the three, but that doesn't mean I don't admire some polymaths who lived in the 20th century, or even some who are still alive in the 21st. And so the question about the relevance of polymaths in a world of specialists, which I think, if in a world where so many people specialize, we need polymaths more than ever. We need polymaths as a kind of specialist in generalities, because unless you try to master several disciplines, you won't see the connections between them. Quite a number of discoveries in the natural sciences and the social sciences have come about because polymaths who've studied several subjects have noticed analogies between problems and solutions in fields which are sometimes wide apart. One polymath was a fellow of my college, Emmanuel, in the early 19th century. That's Thomas Young. And for example, he noticed, because he studied both light and sound, he noticed analogies between them. And therefore, he talked about waves in both cases. Later scientists decided that they weren't waves but particles, but that's another matter. And so I think it's desperately important to make connections. And indeed, I participated in the age of specialization because I supervised PhD students, not just in history, but in a university like Cambridge. Each professor has to specialize in one relatively small bit of history. So I had PhD students only working on Europe in the 16th, 17th centuries. But of course, they would only choose a tiny bit of that because in 3 years, they had to make an original contribution and finish their PhD. But I always said to them, at the beginning and the end of the dissertation, you must go beyond your speciality. In the body of the dissertation, that's fine. You do your specialist work. But at the beginning and end, you make a real effort to connect it to what's going on all around it. Only in that way, more people will read you. In that way, people working in other subjects can learn from you. So that means be a little bit of a polymath, at least when you're writing your introduction and conclusion, even if you can't do it in the main part of the text. I most welcome the initiative of the Polymath Festival because I've been discovering in the last few years, and still more rapidly in the last few months, having published a book and received letters from people in different parts of the world who've said that they think that they are polymaths, they would like to try to become polymaths, and so on. It seems that the time is really right for some kind of get together and exchange of experiences as well as exchange of knowledge. And of course, it would have been wonderful if this could have been a real meeting in real space and real time, where, because at conferences, as I'm sure you know as well as I do, the conversations over coffee in the corridors is often more illuminating than anybody had said at the lectern on the stage. But having a conference online, a Zoom conference, is a lot better than no conference. So I'm looking forward to the days, maybe later this year, maybe next year, when this kind of exchange will take place personally, face to face. But meanwhile, I very much welcome your initiative, Wakas. If you are an aspiring polymath, I have to give you a warning, but I shall encourage you all the same. First of all, you realize it isn't easy. If you were to read my chapter, which I call a collective portrait of polymaths in my book, you find that polymaths have unusual amount of energy. They are workaholics. Very often they don't sleep for more than 4 hours a night because their drive for more knowledge is keeping them up. But if you do have this drive, if you do have the imagination to see connections where other people hadn't seen them, I think then don't let yourself just become a specialist. Try to keep some time for seeing the big picture all the way through. Remember that, at least in some cases, breadth does not mean giving up depth. It just means seeing the connections between what you're doing and, first of all, the neighbors, and then beyond the neighbors of the neighbors. I really do recommend that you take this step by step. You have one discipline, so look at the edges. If you're a historian, look at anthropology or sociology. When you've got some idea of what that's about, then you can go on to one of the neighbors of that second discipline, and so on. I think in that way, you can avoid the danger of a little knowledge about everything, but not understanding anything very well. So with that in mind, good luck.